Being season appropriate, it seems the right time to discuss another frightful Microsoft tale, one that relates very much to fiendish goings on, and that's mainly because the Halloween documents, as they are known, are a series of confidential documents leaked from Microsoft about the threats perceived from external companies and, significantly, open source software. Squarespace, thank you for sponsoring this content. In their entirety, they are an incredibly interesting and somewhat damning insight into Microsoft's thinking as they moved into the new millennium.
£1 million worth of fireworks then.
The reason they're known as the Halloween documents is simply because they were mostly leaked around this spooky season across several years. We begin with open source software, a new development methodology, written by Microsoft software engineer Vinod Valapillo and sent in August 1998. In October, this original document was leaked to the American software developer and open source advocate Eric S. Raymond, who would later coin the Halloween moniker. It was he who in turn would expose the document to the press, who covered it with varying degrees of accuracy and completedness in early November, with the New York Times commenting that the memo warns that free software can meet or exceed the quality of commercial programs and describes it as a potentially serious threat to Microsoft, which is by and large the gist of things, and Microsoft even acknowledged to the New York Times that the document was indeed authentic in their November 3rd article about it. This led some to speculate that the document was leaked intentionally in line with Microsoft's FUD or FUD practices. What is FUD? Well, it stands for Fear, Uncertainty, Doubt. It's a methodology Microsoft subscribed to undermine products launched by competitors which posed a threat. If the rival product is better in some fashion, for example, it's free, and facts therefore cannot win the day, scaremongering is instead employed to cast a shadow of doubt in consumers' minds. I've previously discussed how Microsoft used this against DR-DOS and stacker disk compression, to name a few. This then could just be a carefully worded script designed to make the public think less of open source offerings. However, the fact that this document is just so raw and honest towards Microsoft's outlook and actually discusses FUD and other internal strategies suggests that it is in fact an authentic leak. And the reason Microsoft confirmed its authenticity was likely to avoid further conflict whilst the US Department of Justice were pursuing an antitrust action against them. On his website, catb.org, Eric has compiled a list of key quotes from the document which illuminate this. OSS, open source software, poses a direct short-term revenue and platform threat to Microsoft, particularly in server space. Additionally, the intrinsic parallelism and free idea exchange in OSS has benefits that are not replicable with our current licensing model, and therefore present a long-term developer mindshare threat. Recent case studies provide very dramatic evidence that commercial quality can be exceeded by OSS projects. OSS is long-term credible. FUD tactics cannot be used to combat it. Linux and other OSS advocates are making a progressively more credible argument that OSS software is at least as robust, if not more, than commercial alternatives. Linux has been deployed in mission-critical commercial environments with an excellent pool of public testimonials. Linux can win as long as services or protocols are commodities. Rather than planting a seed of concern in the minds of the public, this document actively praises open source software, and it's very clear that Microsoft had deep reservations about it, particularly around the rival operating system, Linux. But that last quote, that's quite concerning. It's also mentioned elsewhere in the document, the decommodization of protocols. For core software to be successful, it's usually dependent on external standardized components. For example, you might take the .doc file used by Word. Open source word processors would also need to use this file format, otherwise the masses would simply stick with Word, the only program that could read their documents. Microsoft were therefore talking about the possibility of making it impossible, or at least difficult, for other parties to make use of formats like this, and even more fundamental commodities such as TCP/IP. If they changed how Windows worked with files or the outside world whilst they had the common advantage, it could spell doom for competitors. Of course, this had its own risk. Ironically, this was partly the downfall of Linux's predecessor, Unix, as various Unix vendors tried to give their versions a proprietary edge over others, therefore decommoditizing them, creating features that didn't exist on other Unices, and therefore causing incompatibilities between systems. This erased the standardization essential for interoperability. The document itself was clearly penned for high-level management within Microsoft to consume, including Bill Gates himself. The second Halloween document was leaked on the 3rd of November 1998. Eric writes as perhaps a direct result of the national press coverage. It's a direct follow-up to the first document, but with a heavy focus on Linux and an evaluation of its credibility against Windows. Dated the 11th of August 1998 and penned again by Vinod and Josh Cohen, the document begins with a synopsis and history of Linux itself, before delving into more detail about its inner workings and distributions. The swelling numbers on the Linux user base succinctly communicates why exactly Microsoft was so concerned about their business. Linux represents a best-of-breed Unix that has a long-term credibility which exceeds many other competitive OSs. Most of the primary apps that people require when they move to Linux are already available for free. An advanced Win32 GUI user would have a short learning cycle to become productive. Consumers love it. You know, this is very much a document that is selling Linux to its reader rather than trying to demolish it, and it seems clear that Microsoft had no real strategy for dealing with this monumental threat to their operation. At the time, other businesses such as Corel were jumping on the wagon of actually shipping their own flavour of Linux as a commercial package. This was not only making it more accessible to the average user who preferred buying their product from shop shelves, but it was also demonstrating how powerful Linux was becoming. If you can sell something that's free for a commercial profit, then you're doing well. At one point, the document states, Compaq and Dell merely have to credibly threaten Linux adoption in order to push for lower OEM OS pricing, demonstrating the issues that Linux was already creating for Windows profits. Of course, for some, reading these leaked stories and documents, this may have actually been the first time they heard of this new Linux operating system, and so Microsoft would need to respond to the leak. That response has been named the Halloween document 3. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Honestly, it's so quick to knock out a website using Squarespace. I made this one in about 3 minutes. I think it captures the mood perfectly. Just imagine what you could do in just half an hour. Visit squarespace.com/nostalgianerd to get started and get 10% off your first website or custom domain. After confirming their authenticity, Microsoft tried to largely downplay the contents of Halloween 1 and 2. However, the prominent Linux user, Henk Kloping, did manage to get a statement from Microsoft's public relations manager in the Netherlands. Aurelia Vandenberg was quoted with the following: "It's routine and appropriate for Microsoft to research and write about all competitors, both from a business model point of view and a technical point of view. It is not an official position by Microsoft on Linux, it is a technical analysis written by an engineer in a staff capacity and designed to encourage discussion. But Aurelia did also try and put down the position of Linux, stating that it had no long-term roadmap and no way to get one, no intellectual property protection means that the deep investments needed by the industry in infrastructure will gravitate to other business models, and unless Linux violates IP rights, it will fail to deliver innovation over the long run. In hindsight, we can perhaps scoff at these remarks, as Linux has continued to move from strength to strength, and offered many innovations over Windows which the community will swear by. It later became apparent that this was in fact an official set of statements filtered down from Microsoft HQ, distributed to local offices. The responses were listed under the Windows NT Server section of their website, indicating that Microsoft were both keen to undo any damage to prominent users, whilst trying to remain as discreet about it as possible. However, it does back up that the original documents were indeed leaked without a plan, and that Microsoft were deeply troubled by the notion of a free and credible operating system, and rightly so. Halloween Documents 4 through 6 are writings and responses by Eric S. Raymond himself regarding the chatter and noise of the whole debacle, but Halloween 7 was presented as a Microsoft internal Linux strategic review at the Berlin Microsoft offices in September 2002. The main core of the document here is Microsoft's own marketing research, which heavily indicates Microsoft's FUD tactics were indeed failing, as had been suggested they would back in Halloween 1. Microsoft's research had polled developers, IT, and non-IT business development managers and indicated that 77% were familiar with Linux and 86% of those found Linux favourable over Windows. 40% indicated that the low total cost of ownership was a strong factor, although 33% said that the fact it was just an alternative to Microsoft was strong enough alone. Off the back of this, a memo from Microsoft sent on the 25th of November 2002 from Orlando Ayala to the general managers of Microsoft regional subsidiaries would become known as Halloween 8. Halloween 8 warns its recipients to expect a lot more open source software adoption announcements and requests an increased effort on marketing to try and squash the growing threat. Which really leads us on to Halloween 10, the point at which matters really escalate. Here we have an email from Mike Andera to Chris Sontag. Now, Chris Sontag was the Vice President and General Manager of SCO Source, responsible for overseeing the development and licensing of SCO's intellectual property holdings. Okay, great, that sounds fancy and important. So who are SCO? Well, SCO Group began back in 2002 after a renaming of Caldera International, a company that sold an easy-to-use implementation of Linux, much like the Corel package I mentioned earlier. In August 2000, Caldera purchased Unix technology from the Santa Cruz operation, and so under SCO were looking to present a unified, profitable view of Unix and Linux that could satisfy high-end business requirements. Read into that what you will. This ultimately meant that SCO would enter into various legal disputes with various Linux vendors and users, particularly around the reported source code that was donated by IBM into Linux, and whether IBM had the right to do that. But the key question here is, where all of a sudden did they get the funding for these actions to try and thwart Linux's open source majesty? Well, on the 4th of March 2002, this leaked internal email, Halloween 10, detailed how Microsoft had raised up to $106 million to kindly help SCO out in that regard. Or at least that's how it appears from this perspective. This cash injection was via a deal with the venture capital firm Baystar, which to those with a cynical nature might think of as, I don't know, some kind of laundering or distancing process. The memo reveals that Microsoft will have brought in $86 million for us, including Baystar. The next deal we should be able to get from 16 to 20 million. At this time, SCO's cash reserves were 68.5 million, suggesting that SCO would have been in debt if not for Microsoft's intervention. It seems then that Microsoft had outsourced their anti-Linux strategies and were desperately trying to turn something open source into something of a grey area. But fortunately for us, it was not to be. Despite their cash injections, SCO Group would file for bankruptcy in September 2007. In 2011, Unexis would purchase their software product business, but the ongoing legal case between SCO and IBM due to alleged violations of IBM's Unix licenses would mean the shell of SCO would continue to limp on. On the 30th of March 2010, in the separate case of SCO versus Novell, it was decided that Novell actually owned most of the disputed copyrights. This meant the scope of the case against IBM and Linux narrowed, and in October 2017 was dismissed with prejudice. But an appeal by SCO means that this zombie of a case still lingers. However, Linux also lingers. In fact, it does more than linger, it surges through. And so, despite the best efforts of Microsoft and their hired proxies, it remains an even more painful thorn in their side today. Especially being that it currently runs on the vast majority of web servers and indeed on a high percentage of personal hardware. Maybe Microsoft should have said treat rather than trick, and let them on their way and concentrated on improvements to their own OS, rather than opting for that trick which perhaps did them more harm than good. But hey, Microsoft and Windows are still here as well, so all's well that ends well. This then is where the Halloween documents and indeed this tale ends, but I suggest you go and take a look at Eric's site and take a look at this insightful part of Microsoft's dark history. In any case, thanks for watching and have a horrifying evening. You know, because it's Halloween, I don't actually want you to have a bad evening. Okay, see you later.